Let me tell you about July 1st, 2026. Steve Witkoff and Jared Kushner, the two most senior emissaries of the Trump administration, arrived in Doha, Qatar, to meet the mediators and try to rescue an arrangement that is already beginning to come apart. Iran did send its technical delegation to Doha, but it refused to sit in the same room with Witkoff or Kushner, so every exchange had to pass through Qatar intermediaries. Now here is what almost nobody is telling you about what that actually means. The mainstream coverage is framing this as a sign of Iranian weakness. Iran is cornered. Iran is stalling. Iran is trying to buy time because it has lost bargaining power. I want to argue the exact opposite, and here is why. While attention is fixed on the diplomatic theater in Doha, three developments have unfolded at exactly the same moment, and almost nobody is connecting them. First, Ghalibaf, Iran's chief negotiator and the Speaker of Parliament, has just announced that Iran exported more than 40 million barrels of oil in less than 2 weeks. Less than 2 weeks after the United States lifted its naval blockade. Second, Tehran is pressing aggressively for mandatory fees on every vessel that passes through the Strait of Hormuz. Not suggested, not requested, mandatory. Third, Hezbollah has denounced the US-brokered trilateral framework agreement among America, Israel, and Lebanon as treason, and declared that it will grip its weapons more tightly than ever. These are being treated as three unrelated stories in three different theaters. They're not. They are components of one coherent approach aimed at forcing Washington to choose between the posture it presents publicly and the leverage it actually possesses. Consider what this actually means. We're not going to spend our time on missile inventories or troop counts. We're going to examine the structural logic, the hidden architecture shaping the events you're watching. And when we are finished, I think you will see why the question most of the media keeps asking, whether Iran will sign a final agreement, is the wrong question. The real question is not whether Iran signs. The real question is this: on day 61, when the 60-day May window ends, which side is in greater pain? Okay, let's get into it. Here's a number that I guarantee you have not seen, given its full context, anywhere. 40 million barrels of oil in less than 2 weeks. Ghalibaf presented that figure publicly almost as though it were a battlefield triumph. And in one sense it is. Think about what that means structurally. Iran has just come through a direct conflict with the United States and Israel. Its nuclear sites were destroyed in Operation Midnight Hammer. Khamenei died in an airstrike. Inflation is at 88.6%. I am not minimizing any of that. Those are real losses, serious losses, undeniable losses. But here is what that framing leaves out. Iran is still selling oil at scale, 40 million barrels in under 2 weeks. And independent maritime tracking sources place the total even higher, closer to 50 million barrels. With oil prices elevated precisely because of the conflict that so many people assume would break Iran, you can calculate for yourself what that revenue stream begins to look like. It is not trivial. And here is where it gets genuinely interesting. Ghalibaf described the Strait of Hormuz as, in his words, a divine gift granted to Iran during this war, and he called it their greatest instrument of power. Stop there for a moment. The head of Iran's negotiating team, the man sitting in Doha right now, did not describe that waterway as a neutral shipping corridor or as a maritime passage protected by international law. He described it as a weapon. His weapon. This was not a verbal accident. It was a strategic declaration. And here is the concept that ties us together. That statement matters more than much of what is dominating the news cycle. Look at the map. At its narrowest point, the Strait of Hormuz is about 33 kilometers wide. On a good day, it almost feels swimmable. Yet through that narrow choke point moves 20% of the world's entire oil supply every single day. Japan receives 75% of its imported energy through that route. China receives 40%. India receives 60%. The Japanese Prime Minister said openly that if Hormuz closes, Japan's economy collapses within 8 to 9 months, not years, months. Iran understands this perfectly well. It has understood it for decades. And now it is exploiting it. Tehran is demanding mandatory charges on all shipping through Hormuz. Oman proposed a voluntary model, something like a service fee for maritime maintenance. Iran rejected that. It must be mandatory. And you may ask, what is the practical distinction? If Iran gets paid either way, why does the wording matter so much? The answer is sovereignty. That is the whole issue. Voluntary payment implies a service arrangement. Mandatory payment implies recognition of authority. Iran does not want to behave like a toll booth operator. It wants the world to acknowledge, formally or functionally, that one of the most strategically consequential waterways on Earth falls under Iranian jurisdiction. Secretary Rubio drew a red line, saying that mandatory fees on an international waterway violate international law. Technically, he is correct. But let me ask you a simple question. Who enforces that? What is the actual enforcement mechanism? If the answer is the US Navy, then we are talking about the same Navy that just lifted a naval blockade because the military and political cost of maintaining it had become too high. That is a very revealing enforcement mechanism. I call this the economic blood transfusion framework. Here's how it works. A state can absorb severe wartime damage and still recover much faster than outside observers expect if it controls a resource the global economy cannot function without. Iran does not need to rebuild every destroyed facility immediately. It does not need to repair every damaged piece of infrastructure right now. It needs to keep the oil flowing and preserve operational command over the strait. Revenue does the rest. That is why Ghalibaf was smiling when he discussed those export figures. Not because Iran is dominating militarily, but because it is regaining strength financially. And over long stretches of geopolitical time, financial endurance often outlasts military spectacle. Which brings us to the part nobody is saying. This transforms the context of the Doha talks. Iran is not bargaining like a state gasping for relief. It is bargaining like a state with growing oil income, a functioning energy weapon, and a structural advantage over a maritime choke point that Europe, China, Japan, and India cannot afford to lose. That is not the negotiating position the media keeps describing. Now, I want to zoom out for a moment because I think the biggest strategic error the United States is making in this confrontation becomes visible only if we step back to 1978. On June 26, 2026, Washington arranged what is called the Trilateral Framework Agreement among America, Israel, and Lebanon. 14 points were signed in Washington. The real objective, though no official will say it this plainly, is to detach Lebanon and Hezbollah from Iran's axis of resistance. There is a name for this in international relations scholarship. It is called a wedge strategy. And the United States used this exact logic with extraordinary success once before, in Egypt in 1978. Here's what happened. Washington pulled Egypt out of the Arab coalition and out of the Soviet orbit with a single agreement. Israel was pressured to return the entire Sinai Peninsula to Egypt, not part of it. All of it, billions of dollars in annual aid were added. Sadat accepted. Egypt signed peace with Israel. The Arab United Front cracked from within, and the Soviet Union lost its most important Arab client state almost overnight. This remains one of the great geopolitical victories of the Cold War for the United States. It genuinely was brilliant. And now, in 2026, Washington is trying to replicate that logic in Lebanon. On the surface, the formula looks strikingly familiar. $0 million in humanitarian assistance. $30 million reimbursed directly to the Lebanese armed forces. The United States leading an international reconstruction coalition. Israel withdrawing from southern Lebanon in phases. In return, Lebanon disarmed Hezbollah and declares that no outside actor may use force on Lebanon's behalf without explicit government authorization, which is simply a refined diplomatic way of saying, Iran, keep your hands off Lebanon. On paper, this resembles a clean copy of Camp David in 1978. In practice, I think it is a slow-moving disaster. I call this the reverse Camp David trap. Here's how it works. In 1978, the United States was separating a sovereign nation state from an outside superpower. Sadat had direct command over the Egyptian military. When he chose to expel Soviet advisors and make peace with Israel, one executive decision was enough. The military obeyed. The state remained coherent. The Soviets had to leave. In 2026, Washington is trying to detach Lebanon from a force that is not external to Lebanon at all. Hezbollah is not some foreign actor merely operating on Lebanese territory. It is deeply woven into Lebanon's political system, its welfare structures, and its economic life. It has sitting members of parliament. It runs hospitals and manages schools. It possesses weapons depots, command networks, and decades of community relationships built into the fabric of the country. And more important than any one of those things, Hezbollah now holds a veto inside Lebanon. Within minutes of the framework being signed in Washington, Hezbollah MP Hassan Fadlallah announced publicly that they would hold their weapons tighter than ever before. Nabi Berri, Hezbollah's most important political ally and the Speaker of the Lebanese parliament, warned that Lebanon stands on the edge of a new civil war. Think about what that means structurally. Iran does not need to launch a single missile. Hezbollah does not need to attack anyone. It only needs to say one word, no. And if it says no, the whole framework collapses from the inside because there is no mechanism, zero, through which anyone can compel implementation of the disarmament clause against Hezbollah's active refusal. The Lebanese armed forces do not possess either the military strength or the political capital required to disarm Hezbollah by force. They are not powerful enough, and if they attempted it, if the last seriously moved against Hezbollah, there is a documented historical risk that the Lebanese army itself would fracture along sectarian lines and Lebanon would slide back into civil war. This is the reverse Camp David trap. America is applying a 20th century playbook to a 21st century structural challenge. In 1978, the obstacle was persuading one leader to make one decision. In 2026, the obstacle is compelling a non-state actor with deep domestic roots to disarm against its will, using a national army too fragile to attempt the task. Those are not the same problem. Treating them as if they are the same is a major analytical mistake. Now let me connect this back to Doha, because this is where the full picture emerges. Why will Iran not meet Witkoff and Kushner face to face? Vance called it a Persian negotiating tactic. That is an interesting label, but I think there is a cleaner explanation. Iran understands that Doha is not the arena where this contest is being decided. The real struggle is taking place in two theaters at once. The first is Beirut, where the trilateral framework agreement will either survive or collapse. Iran already knows that Hezbollah's veto makes collapse the more likely outcome. Tehran built this system. It understands the system better than Washington does. Iran does not need to prevail in Doha to prevail in Beirut. It simply needs patience. The second is Hormuz, where Iran is creating facts on the ground every day that shape what any future agreement can realistically contain. Every barrel exported, every tanker that passes unimpeded, every debate over mandatory versus voluntary fees. Iran is steadily constructing leverage that does not evaporate when the 60-day timer expires. By refusing direct meetings, Tehran is signaling something very specific. We do not need to sit across from you in order to accumulate advantage. Our leverage is being assembled somewhere you are not watching carefully enough. For a country that is supposedly shattered by war, that is a remarkably sophisticated position. Now I want to do something that I think is essential. I want to present the strongest possible case for the other side. Because I never want you to simply accept what I'm telling you. Vance said the United States is in a win-win position. Whether these negotiations work or fail, Washington supposedly benefits either way. And here is the strongest version of that argument. The United States destroyed Iran's nuclear facilities. The supreme leader is dead. Iran's missile program suffered serious damage. Inflation is at 88% and rising. The Iranian economy is under immense strain. From this perspective, America is negotiating from real strength. Iran needs this agreement for economic survival. So regardless of the theater in Doha, regardless of the demands made at the table, the mounting pressure will eventually compel meaningful concessions. This argument has genuine weight to it. It also has historical precedent. That is largely how the United States managed Iraq after 1991. Sustained pressure, military dominance, economic suffocation through sanctions. It worked at least until the next layer of complications emerged. I want to be fair here. This is not a foolish argument. There are real reasons to think that sustained and coordinated American pressure could eventually push Iran towards substantive compromise. But here is precisely what it cannot explain. It cannot explain why, after decades of sanctions, Iran still had an active nuclear program when this conflict began. It cannot explain how Iran, immediately after the naval blockade was lifted, managed to export 40 to 50 million barrels of oil in 2 weeks. Those are not the behaviors of a country that has reached the end of its options. And here's where it gets genuinely interesting. The win-win argument also cannot explain the variable that did not exist in 1991, China and Russia. In 1991, Washington had what I call monopoly on reward power. The United States was the only actor capable of giving Iran what it needed for a real recovery: access to capital markets, technology, export infrastructure, and integration into the global trading system. There was no substitute. The Soviet Union had collapsed. China was still a developing country. Washington held the full deck. In 2026, that is no longer true. China is buying Iranian oil through shipping documentation that records zero country of origin. Russia is providing military technology and blocking serious pressure at the UN Security Council. Not because either one loves Iran. Nobody operates on love in geopolitics. They do it because an Iranian collapse under American pressure would send a message to every state in the Russia-China orbit: defy the United States and there will be no safety net. Beijing and Moscow cannot afford to let that lesson take hold. When both China and Russia are providing Tehran with economic and diplomatic insurance, the American pressure campaign cannot reach the critical mass required for genuine capitulation. The leverage is real. It is simply not sufficient in a multipolar system in the way it once was in a unipolar one. That is the structural flaw in the Vance argument, and it is not a minor flaw. Now let me add one more layer, because I think this may be the most important piece for understanding where this is heading over the next 6 to 18 months. Many analysts, serious analysts, people I respect, have concluded that Iran's axis of resistance has been badly degraded by this conflict. Hezbollah, the Houthis, the armed groups in Iraq. The argument is that Iran's forward defense doctrine has been exposed as less formidable than advertised. The proxies have shown limits. The network as a whole has been reduced in terms of raw capability. That assessment is defensible. But weak and finished are not the same thing. Conflating the two is a serious analytical error. I call this the octopus framework. Here's how it works. If you cut off one tentacle from an octopus, the animal survives. Some species can even regenerate the lost limb. And while that regeneration is taking place, the remaining tentacles do not become passive. They become more adaptive, more independent, and often harder to target precisely because they are no longer moving as one tightly coordinated whole. That is exactly what is happening to the axis of resistance. Look closely at the war itself. When Iran came under direct attack, its proxy forces behaved with striking restraint. Hezbollah did not open every front available to it. The Houthis acted carefully. Iraqi groups did not escalate into full regional conflagration. Why? Because each node in this network has its own local logic, its own constraints, its own calculation of how much risk is rational given conditions inside its own country. Hezbollah is fighting right now for political survival inside Lebanon. It is under pressure from the framework agreement, from disarmament demands, and from Lebanese political factions, Sunnis, Christians, Druze, who see this moment as an opportunity to permanently reduce Hezbollah's power. Opening a massive military front while also fighting for domestic political survival is not a rational calculus. The Houthis have a different calculus. They must project enough danger to deter regional adversaries, but not so much aggression that Saudi Arabia or the UAE concludes the risk of allowing them to exist now exceeds the cost of eliminating them. They must manage their own Yemeni internal dynamics. The Iraqi groups are embedded inside the Iraqi state itself. They hold government positions, they receive budget allocations, they maintain political parties. They have every incentive to prefer stability over a war that could destroy everything they have constructed within Iraq's formal power structure. So what does this tell us? The axis of resistance is in transition. It is moving from a centralized model in which Tehran coordinated large synchronized operations toward a decentralized network in which each node acts autonomously according to local conditions. More independent, more adaptive, more deeply rooted domestically than before. And here is what I think Washington is underestimating. A decentralized network embedded locally is harder to destroy than a centralized one. To defeat the old axis, you had to sever the command lines from Tehran. To defeat the emerging axis, you had to confront each node separately, in each country, under different political rules, with different domestic consequences, and at potentially enormous political cost in every case. This is why Hezbollah's refusal to disarm under the trilateral framework is not merely about weapons in southern Lebanon. It is a live demonstration of what the post-war axis looks like. more dispersed, more entrenched locally, and paradoxically more resilient than the version that existed before the conflict. Before the war, Hezbollah could be targeted as an extension of Iranian foreign policy. After the war, Hezbollah must be confronted as a political actor inside a sovereign state called Lebanon. Those are different fights, governed by different legal frameworks, different legitimacy questions, and different costs. Iran understands this better than any outside observer because Iran spent 30 years building this system. It knows that the decentralized version of the axis emerging from this conflict may actually prove more durable than the one that entered it. The octopus lost a tentacle, but it is already assessing the limbs it still has and figuring out how to make them harder to track. Okay, let me pull this together. I think the full picture becomes very clear when you place the pieces side by side. 40 million barrels of oil in 2 weeks. Iran is recovering financially faster than the consensus predicted, using the very commodity whose price the conflict itself drove upward. Hormuz is, by Iran's own declaration, a weapon. Every day, new facts are being established about who holds operational authority over the most important shipping lane on Earth. Iran will not sit face to face with Witkoff in Doha, not because it is frightened, but because Doha is not where this contest is being decided. Beirut and Hormuz are, and in both places, Iran currently enjoys structural advantage. The trilateral framework has no credible enforcement mechanism. Hezbollah has already vetoed it in public. The Lebanese army cannot impose it without risking civil war. American forces in Lebanon can observe, they can record, they cannot fight Hezbollah. The axis of resistance is mutating. It is not weaker in the sense of being removable. It is decentralizing to a form that is harder to target and more deeply embedded in the domestic politics of every country where it operates. China and Russia are giving Tehran the economic and diplomatic insulation that prevents American pressure from reaching a true breaking point. Now, I want to be precise about something. I could be wrong. I could be wrong in part or wrong in the overall conclusion. These are my frameworks. These are my theories. I have been wrong before and I will be wrong again. But I will say this with confidence. The narrative that America is simply winning comprehensively, that the win-win framing is accurate, that Iran is cornered, is overlooking at least 3 structural factors that could alter the outcome in fundamental ways. And structural factors do not vanish just because a military campaign looked impressive. So here's what I want you to watch carefully in the next 48 to 72 hours. First, watch whether the United States releases any portion of the $6 billion in frozen Iranian assets. Ghalibaf has been explicit that this is a precondition for substantive engagement, not a slogan, a precondition. If Washington refuses and that money remains frozen, then the memorandum of understanding is quietly dying while the 60-day clock keeps moving toward a hard deadline. If Washington releases even part of it, Iran immediately gains leverage going into the next round and will use that leverage to press for further concessions. There is no scenario in which releasing that money makes life simpler for Washington. Second, watch what happens if the Lebanese armed forces actually attempt to move into the pilot zones in southern Lebanon. The framework requires the LAF to enter designated areas physically and assume operational control from Israeli forces. If the LAF moves in and Hezbollah does not obstruct that move, then the agreement still has a pulse, faint but real. If Hezbollah blocks the movement politically or physically, as its public posture strongly suggests it will, then the framework is dead on arrival. And if that happens, America faces a choice with no good options. It can allow Israel to remain indefinitely in southern Lebanon, which contradicts the framework and alienates Beirut, or it can pressure Israel to withdraw anyway, which demonstrates that the framework was empty from the beginning and cost Washington credibility with Tel Aviv. Neither outcome is attractive. Third, watch China's silence regarding the mandatory Hormuz fee proposal. China receives 40% of its oil through the Strait of Hormuz. No major power is more dependent on that waterway functioning freely. And yet Beijing has said absolutely nothing in opposition to Iran's mandatory fee proposal. 0 statements. 0 diplomatic objections, nothing. In diplomacy, silence from a major power is never neutral. China's silence is communicating 2 messages at once. To Iran, we are not going to block this. To the United States, do not expect us to join a coalition to stop it. That silence is doing more real strategic work than almost anything Washington or Tehran has said aloud this week. Here's what I want you to watch carefully in the coming days. Read the 10-point declaration released by 60 members of Iran's Assembly of Experts at the end of June. This is the document that bars Iran's negotiators from making concessions on nuclear rights and reaffirms hardline positions that constrain President Pezeshkian's diplomatic team. Read it carefully and then ask yourself a simple question. If those are the internal constraints Iran's negotiators genuinely cannot cross, because their domestic political survival depends on staying within those boundaries, then what does a final agreement even look like? What could it possibly contain that both sides could still present as a victory? If you want to verify this yourself, and I always encourage you to read the Al Jazeera Center for Studies report on what the Memorandum of Understanding actually means for regional power dynamics. Read the Wall Street Journal piece on Trump weighing renewed strikes on Iran. Read Ghalibaf's full interview on Press TV, where he describes Hormuz as a divine gift. Check the numbers, verify the facts, challenge the framework I've just laid out. Push back on me in the comments if you think I've missed something. That is how we get closer to the truth. Because one thing I have learned from studying these dynamics for a very long time is that whenever the mainstream consensus becomes too comfortable, whenever everyone converges on a neat and simple story about who is winning, that is usually the precise moment when you need to look harder at the structural variables the consensus is ignoring. Right now, the consensus says America is in a position of strength and Iran is cornered. I am saying, look at the 40 million barrels. Look at who refuses to sit down in Doha and why. Look at Hezbollah's veto operating in real time. Look at the silence from Beijing. Look at the octopus that has taken a hit but has not died and is now working out how to regrow its tentacles in a form that is more difficult to find. Then ask yourself honestly, does that look like a country with no room left to maneuver? And the last thing I want to leave you with today, because this is the question I keep returning to, the one that should genuinely be keeping people awake in Washington right now, is this. When Ghalibaf stands up and calls Hormuz a divine gift, when Iran keeps refusing face-to-face meetings in Doha while pumping out 50 million barrels of oil, when Tehran pushes for mandatory control over the world's most critical shipping lane, when Hezbollah announces publicly that it will never disarm, when China watches all of it and says nothing. The real question is not whether Iran signs a final deal. The real question is this: on day 61, when the window closes, who needs this deal more? Think about that. Sit with it. I will see you in the next one.